In 5 days, Iran did something no military power has done to America in modern history. Not Russia, not China, not the Soviet Union at the height of the Cold War. In 5 days, 120 hours, Iran destroyed half of America's Patriot missile defense systems deployed across the entire Middle East. Half gone in 5 days. Let that number breathe for a second before we get into what it actually means. Because the financial cost alone is staggering, $7 to $8 billion of American defense infrastructure, eliminated using weapons that cost a fraction of a percent of that value. But the financial cost isn't even the most devastating part. The most devastating part is the timeline to replace what was just destroyed. America manufactures 96 THAAD interceptor missiles per year. 96. That's 8 per month. 2 per week. Iran fired 500 ballistic missiles in the first week alone. And that was the warm-up phase, the cheap weapons, the expendable arsenal Iran used specifically to drain American defenses before deploying anything serious. The math is not complicated. It is, however, catastrophic. Trump has now demanded emergency production increases. 400 interceptors per year instead of 96. The defense contractors nodded. The engineers looked at their production lines, their component supply chains, their specialist workforce requirements. And the answer that came back was the answer nobody in Washington wanted to hear. That's when the expanded production capacity comes online, 7 years from now. The industrial base, the technical components, the trained personnel required to manufacture these systems at scale. You cannot conjure them out of urgency or executive orders. They take years to build. The factories need motors and guidance systems and specialized materials that have their own supply chains, their own production timelines, their own bottlenecks. America's missile defense manufacturing capacity was built for peacetime maintenance and modest restocking. It was never built for a war that burns through interceptors faster than they can be produced. Iran's military planners knew this number. They knew America made 96 interceptors a year. They designed their campaign around it. Fire enough cheap projectiles fast enough, and the math does the work for you. In week 1, Iran forced American defense systems to burn through approximately 150 THAAD interceptors, almost 2 years of production capacity, stopping a fraction of Iran's cheapest weapons. The expensive radar systems are now destroyed. The interceptors are depleted, and Iran hasn't touched its advanced missile arsenal yet. The old weapons, the low-grade drones, the older generation ballistic missiles, are now exhausted. Iran used them as a tool to empty American quivers. They served their purpose. They're done. What comes next is what Iran was actually saving. Now here's the piece that should genuinely unsettle every defense analyst who has spent years assuming American military dominance is a permanent feature of the global landscape. America cannot bring replacement systems from elsewhere without creating new vulnerabilities. The Patriot and THAAD batteries still operating in South Korea and Guam, the ones protecting American allies in the Pacific theater, are the only significant reserve America has. Moving them to the Middle East means stripping Pacific defenses. Leaving them in place means the Middle East gap stays open. There is no third option. The production pipeline is empty for years. The reserve is committed elsewhere. And the gap in the Middle East is not theoretical. It is operational and growing by the day. This is what strategic exhaustion looks like. Not a single catastrophic defeat. A methodical, calculated draining of resources across multiple vectors simultaneously until the defender has nothing left to defend with. Scott Ritter, the former U.S. Army intelligence officer who was raided by the FBI for saying exactly this would happen, warned the world. He said American bases would be hit. He said Iranian accuracy would be devastating. He said the casualty numbers would be something the American public wasn't being prepared for. His reward for being right about everything was a federal raid and a media blackout. The men who ignored him are now asking where the interceptors went. Oil is at $95 a barrel today. Analysts are no longer debating whether it hits $150. They're debating the timeline. And one prominent scenario, if Gulf oil production cuts materialize as storage capacity maxes out, has $200 a barrel in the discussion. $200 a barrel. The last time oil spiked at a fraction of that level, it caused a decade of stagflation across the Western world. We're in week 1 of Iran's advanced weapons phase. The real campaign hasn't started yet. Iran has 31 active command centers, 31 separate military command structures, each with its own designated targets, its own operational chain, its own standing orders. Some are tasked with Israel, some with Gulf state infrastructure, some with American naval assets, some with Gulf military installations, some with regional shipping lanes. And here's the critical detail that changes everything about the diplomatic situation. The man who could coordinate all 31 and apply strategic restraint, who could tell certain commands to hold, who could manage the pace and intensity of operations to preserve negotiating space, is gone. America killed him. When you eliminate a military leader of that authority, you don't create a power vacuum that weakens the enemy. You create 31 autonomous command structures with standing orders, established target packages, and no central authority telling any of them to slow down. That is what America and Israel created when they killed Iran's supreme leader. Not a decapitated organization, a decentralized one. And decentralized military commands with standing orders and operational independence don't stop because a diplomat makes a phone call. They execute their missions until ordered to stop by a legitimate authority. And that authority no longer exists. China tried to broker talks. Nothing happened. European nations attempted mediation. Nothing happened. Russia attempted back-channel communication. Nothing happened. Not because Iran is being irrational, because there is genuinely no single decision-maker with the authority to call all 31 commands simultaneously to stand down. America destroyed the off-ramp when it pulled the trigger. This is not an abstraction. This is the operational reality that every intelligence service in the world is now contending with. The conflict cannot be diplomatically resolved because the structure required for Iran to honor a diplomatic resolution no longer exists in the form that signed agreements require. You need a counterpart. You need someone with command authority. You need the chain of control that American bombs deliberately severed. Now let's talk about Europe. Because what's happening there right now adds another dimension to this crisis that most coverage is missing entirely. Europe has no gas. Russia, which was supposed to be isolated and weakened by Western sanctions after Ukraine, has done something elegant and ruthless. It told Europe it won't supply them. Not can't, won't. Russia looked at the Middle East conflict, looked at the Gulf energy disruption, looked at Europe's position, simultaneously cut off from Russian gas and now facing Middle Eastern oil chaos, and decided this was the moment to maximize leverage. European governments that 2 years ago were lecturing the world about energy independence and the transition away from fossil fuels are now sitting in emergency energy sessions, trying to figure out how to keep their populations warm and their factories running through a crisis that was entirely predictable and entirely preventable. The German industrial economy, the engine of European prosperity, is facing energy costs that make manufacturing in Germany increasingly non-competitive with manufacturing anywhere else. French households are receiving utility bills that are reshaping family budgets. Eastern European countries, who warned loudest about energy dependency and were most loudly ignored, are watching the dependency crisis they predicted arrive exactly as predicted. Meanwhile, Russia is at the table, patient, available, with a price, and that price is a negotiated end to Western opposition to Russian territorial gains in Ukraine, essentially a recognition of what Russia took. The energy crisis Iran accidentally triggered in the Gulf is giving Russia the leverage to close the Ukraine chapter on terms Moscow could never have achieved militarily. 3 crises, 1 beneficiary. Back to the economic numbers that will land in every household on Earth, regardless of geography. Oil at $95 is today's price. The structural factors pushing it higher are not going away. Gulf storage tanks are full or filling. Production cuts are mathematically inevitable within weeks. Shipping insurance for Gulf routes has tripled, making the oil that does move dramatically more expensive by the time it reaches refineries. And refineries themselves are running their own inventory calculations, buying what they can now at $95 because their analysts believe waiting means paying $130. That self-reinforcing dynamic, anticipatory buying, driving prices higher, which confirms fears, which drives more anticipatory buying, is the mechanism behind every major oil price spike in history. And every indicator in the current market is flashing the same signal. $150 is not a prediction, it's a base case. $200 is the tail risk that serious analysts are no longer dismissing as impossible. Here's what $150 oil means for a family of 4 in a developed economy, roughly $3,000 to $4,000 in additional annual costs. For a family in a developing economy, where energy costs represent a larger share of income and there are fewer buffers, it means something closer to a choice between fuel and food. 8 billion people, 1 month into a conflict that was supposed to be over in 4 weeks. And Iran hasn't fired its advanced weapons yet. Let's do the math that the American government is hoping you don't do yourself. America produces 96 THAAD interceptors per year. Iran fired 500 ballistic missiles in week 1. The cheap week, the old inventory week, the strategic depletion week, designed specifically to burn through American defenses before the real campaign begins. Even assuming a generous intercept rate, America burned through close to 2 years of interceptor production in 12 days. The radar systems that guide those interceptors have been destroyed in Jordan. The Patriot batteries, half of all American Patriot systems deployed in the region, are gone. The replacement timeline is 2033, 7 years. The current conflict timeline, based on Trump's own revised estimates, is 7 months minimum. Those two numbers don't coexist in any version of reality where American military credibility in the region survives intact. You cannot fight a 7-month war with a 7-year replacement timeline. The math produces one outcome regardless of what statements come out of Washington, regardless of what the defense contractors promise, regardless of how many B-2 bombers fly over how many targets. America has already lost the defense war in the Middle East. The question now is only how long the offensive capability holds before the political and economic cost forces a decision that the military situation has been demanding for weeks. Here's what the decision looks like when it finally comes. And history is clear on how this type of situation resolves. When military capability is exhausted, when domestic political support has collapsed, when allies are distancing themselves, when the economic cost is landing on the civilian population with increasing force, leaders look for a way to stop that doesn't look like stopping. A ceasefire framed as a strategic pause, a diplomatic engagement framed as strength, a withdrawal framed as mission completion. The framing changes, the underlying reality doesn't. America will leave the Middle East military footprint it currently holds. The only variable is whether that departure is orderly or chaotic, negotiated or forced. Whether it happens in a way that preserves some U.S. influence in the post-conflict regional order, or whether it happens in a way that permanently hands that order to China, Russia, and a regionally dominant Iran. The off-ramp that preserves the most is still technically available. Negotiate directly, acknowledge Iranian security concerns as legitimate, commit to a framework for base drawdown, and secure a ceasefire before the advanced missile phase fully deploys. The cost of that off-ramp in domestic political terms is high. The cost of not taking it, in military assets and economic damage and lives and long-term strategic position, is higher by every objective measure. But objective measures are rarely what drives these decisions. What drives them is the moment the domestic political cost of continuation finally exceeds the domestic political cost of stopping. In America right now, 90% of the population opposes this war. That number was 93% in support of Afghanistan after September 11th. The contrast isn't just striking, it's historically unprecedented. America has never entered a major military conflict with this level of domestic opposition from week one. And that opposition is going to intensify as oil prices rise, as the economic impact becomes visceral and personal, as the casualty numbers, currently being managed and minimized and carefully framed by an administration that knows the real figures would end the war overnight, eventually become impossible to fully contain. Journalists trying to cover Israel are being blocked at every turn. Reporters say plainly that they cannot get accurate information about what's happening inside the country. Bunkers are being hit, buildings are being destroyed, and the official casualty numbers from American installations, where direct missile strikes are being reported with single-digit death tolls, are being treated with open skepticism by every military analyst who understands what those weapons do to the people inside those buildings. The truth has a way of getting out. It always does. The only question is the timeline. In the meantime, while the political calculation slowly turns, while the economic pain builds, while the military math becomes impossible to dispute, the 31 Iranian command centers continue their operations, each with its target list, each with its standing orders, each operating in the autonomous mode that was created the moment American bombs killed the one man with the authority to coordinate them all toward restraint. The Gulf, that was the safest region on Earth 5 years ago, is unrecognizable today. The petrodollar system that underwrote American economic dominance for 50 years is fracturing. The missile defense architecture that cost hundreds of billions to build is half destroyed and unreplaceable for 7 years. And the advanced Iranian weapons, the ones that weren't fired during the depletion phase, the ones that were carefully preserved while the cheap inventory did its work, are still in their launch systems, fully fueled, fully targeted, waiting. History doesn't grade leaders on their intentions. It grades them on results. And the results of this particular chapter are going to be studied in military academies and economics departments and political science programs for the next 100 years. As a case study in what happens when arrogance replaces analysis, when certainty replaces intelligence, when the people with the power to prevent catastrophe chose, at every available off-ramp, to accelerate toward it instead. The missiles are still coming, and America just ran out of ways to stop them.